Here to tell us more about the case is the Hill's courts and legal reporter, Zach Schonfeld. Zach, you've been on the ground covering this. What's the latest?
Hey, Robbie. Coming out of these oral arguments yesterday, it does seem that the Supreme Court is leaning towards siding with those parents who say that Montgomery County's lack of an opt-out option for their children to not be exposed to those books with LGBTQ themes in elementary schools, that is a substantial burden on their free exercise rights under the First Amendment. So they say that it amounts to the point where the Supreme Court needs to allow them to have this opt-out option. And like I said, coming out of these arguments, it did seem that especially among the Supreme Court's conservative majority, that they were inclined by the end of that argument, which lasted about 2.5 hours, to side with those parents. We heard especially some of this criticism from Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who was one of Donald Trump's appointees to the court. He himself is actually a resident of Montgomery County. He talked about that he's lived there his whole life, and he actually said at one point that he was mystified by what the county was doing here. Let's take a listen.
And Montgomery County has been a beacon of that religious liberty for all these years, with a strong Catholic population, a substantial Jewish population, lots of different Protestant. I mean, you drive down any Connecticut Avenue or George Avenue, you see religious building after religious building. And I guess I'm surprised, given that this is the hill we're going to die on in terms of not respecting religious liberty.
And in fact, right at the end of the argument, Justice Kavanaugh had told the lawyer for Montgomery County, he said he did a good job, but that it was a tough argument, which is never something that a lawyer wants to hear, is a dead giveaway as any of where the court is headed here.
Now, Zach, on the other side of this argument is Ketanji Brown Jackson, who repeatedly expressed concerns, saying basically, if you allow families to opt out of learning from LGBTQ plus books, where will it end? So what else is she worried about?
Yeah, this is something that we heard from both her as well as some of the other liberal justices. They kept drawing issues they were raising concerns that there was no way to draw lines here, and that, even if they agreed that these parents and their objections, they should be given an opt-out option, they were concerned about a flood of cases that could potentially happen after this ruling. In addition to that, Justice Jackson, who is President Biden's sole appointee to the court, we also heard her talk about, these other options that parents have. She was, raising questions about, is it really a substantial burden on them exercising their religion when they do have other options, for example, to homeschool their children or to send them to private schools? Now, the parents' attorney pushed back on that, talking about the financial costs that, of course, come along with that. But certainly, despite the court's conservatives leaning towards the parents, we did see a lot of pushback during that 2.5 oral argument by the court's liberals, but particularly Justice Jackson.
And Zach, did we see some tension between the justices themselves? I saw reports that, who was it? Was it Sotomayor and Alito arguing over who was interrupting who? That's kind of an unusual amount of acrimony from between the justices themselves, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I saw that really on display in that courtroom yesterday. There was that moment where Justice Alito was talking and Justice Sotomayor seemed to try to jump in, which, does often happen where the justices kind of try to drive the conversation back to where they want it to go. But as I saw her, look over and try to jump in, it was the Chief Justice, John Roberts, who is essentially, running who gets to speak when. And he kind of gave her a glare as almost to say, don't jump in, let Justice Alito have his turn. So I think that's certainly right, that there was a bit of that, back and forth and kind of glares going between the justices, even more than we see in a normal case.
The Hill's Zach Schonfeld, thank you so much for joining us to break that down.
Thanks for having me.